Welcome to the Introverted Misfit podcast with me, Caroline Smith, where we discuss topics related to the human experience of connection and communication with a slightly awkward introverted twist. In today's episode, we'll explore the key differences between introversion and shyness or social anxiety, how to know which one you are, and how to overcome your fears of socializing if you happen to be both introverted and shy. I want to start out with what may be a slightly controversial question, and that is, are you actually an introvert, or are you shy or maybe even socially anxious while hiding behind the label of introverted? It's entirely possible to be simultaneously both, but as I find myself scrolling through my social media feeds, looking at all of the introvert meme pages that I follow, I notice that a lot of times people will describe behavior that is indicative of a fear of socializing, and sometimes even hints of social awkwardness or social ineptness. But they are, in my opinion, falsely contributing those behaviors to that of being an introvert. And this is not all or every single introvert meme page that I follow. It's just a few here and there that I've noticed that are particularly popular. It's almost like they think, oh, I'm terrified of going outside and potentially seeing a person and having to say a full sentence to them. So I must be an introvert. And as someone who is an introvert and who used to struggle with severe social anxiety and social awkwardness for almost a decade, those terms are not synonymous. So, how are they different? Well, an introvert is someone who is more reserved and quiet, tends to be more introspective, and enjoys spending more time alone than with others. Or if we do spend time with others, you can pretty much guarantee that it won't be a lot of people. And it probably won't be an overstimulating environment. And if it is very loud and overstimulating, we'll start off strong with the socializing with like a few people here or there until our social battery eventually runs out. And then we'll try to find a corner somewhere, trying to get away from the crowd, or try to find a fellow introvert who's also trying to remove themselves from all of the action. And we tend to communicate best in one on one interactions or with just a few people at a time, which allows us to create more meaningful connections and have more thoughtful conversations. For introverts, it really is about quality over quantity in the relationships that we have. And that's not to say that extroverts or ambiverts don't desire quality over quantity in their relationships, but because our interactions are so far few and far between, it's much more of a priority for us. There are actually neurological differences in the way that our brains are wired that makes us very different from more extroverted and outgoing and sociable people. And I go over these details in my episode, The Valuable Role of Introverts in the Introvert Extrovert Balance, which I will link to in the description of this podcast episode. But the short form of it is that introverts and extroverts have differing dopamine reward systems that determine our preferences for either very quiet, peaceful activities or very social activities. So that's really what an introvert is and what separates an introvert from an extrovert. So, how is being introverted different from being shy or having social anxiety? A shy person is someone who is nervous or timid in the company of other people, and social anxiety, which is a little more severe than shyness, is a mental health condition in which the person has an irrational fear of interacting with others. And quick side note here, as someone who struggled with social anxiety for almost a decade because of me being on the autism spectrum, I sort of disagree with the concept of labeling social anxiety as being irrational, like an irrational fear, because I know for me and lots of other people who have a lot of experience with past social rejection and bullying, the fear of people that they have is completely rational. And it makes perfect sense because we've been so scarred by people for so long that we just don't even really trust them anymore. It's like our brain's way of protecting us from what it views as a danger that can harm us because of our past negative experiences. But I'll save the rest of my personal story in that regard for a little later on in this episode. So the key differences to remember are that an introverted person prefers to not be around other people most of the time, and shy or socially anxious people are nervous and even fearful of being around other people. These are the types of people who are so scared to even look at a person out of fear that it will lead to a conversation. They will go out in public and intentionally keep eye contact with the ground or with the floor because they don't even want to risk meeting somebody's eye, especially not a stranger's eye. Their heart often starts beating faster when they see a person coming towards them. And it turns out that at the root of shyness and social anxiety is, of course, like many other mental disorders, it's a combination of genetic and environmental factors. I wrote an article that is on my website titled "Why Am I Shy and Socially Awkward?" which I will also link to below in the description of this episode. And in that article, I include some scientific studies done on both identical and non identical twins about the origins of shyness. And the findings in those studies suggest that genetic contributions account for the stability of shyness, or what they're calling social inhibition, which, in my opinion, sounds like an introvert, if you ask me, from the ages of 6 to 12. And then the individual environmental factors that are unique to each individual, such as how school peers responded to them in the earlier school years, account for the differing levels of shyness. And so basically what the studies were suggesting is that the bulk of shyness comes from a series of constant social rejection or bullying or exclusion, in addition to some genetic predispositions that may make you more of a naturally quieter, introverted, socially timid person. So at this point now, we at least know the differences between being an introvert and being shy or having social anxiety. But what happens when you are both an introvert and you also struggle with shyness and social anxiety? This can often be a much bigger cross to bear because, on one hand, you are at peace when you are alone or with just a few trusted people. But when it does finally come time for you to venture out and talk to people, whether it's at school or in work or in everyday situations like going to the grocery store, you can barely function because you're not only operating from a place of introversion, you're also operating from a place of fear and self doubt and low self confidence. And I do want to share with you some helpful ways that you can start to overcome your shyness while connecting with your unique strengths as an introvert. But first, I want to tell you my own story about overcoming both social anxiety and social awkwardness as an introvert. Because although my story might be a little different than your story, there are a lot of similarities that I think you can relate to and find value in. So, from what my parents have told me, I have struggled with my social skills and my communication and my emotional intelligence slash emotional regulation since I was about 6 years old. All of the really basic behaviors that most of the kids my age were learning and doing naturally, I just didn't understand. Things like how to walk up and start a conversation with a stranger, or how to create and maintain a relationship of any kind, whether it was with a crush or with a potential friend, how to manage my facial expressions and eye contact in a conversation for more than a few seconds, how to read other people's social cues and body language, and especially how to communicate my emotions. I've got so many stories that I could tell you just from my childhood and adolescent years alone. But in one particular story that I remember very vividly, I was on my high school JV tennis team in the ninth grade. And in this particular story, I was playing a doubles match with my teammates in a competition. And I was at the net in this round, and I completely unintentionally hit the ball right into the opponent's forehead very hard because I was at the net and also she was at the net. So we were like in close proximity to each other. And I was really sorry about this. And I really felt very guilty. And so I apologized by saying, I'm sorry. But what I did not realize at the time is that if you say those words, I'm sorry, without any urgency or vocal inflection and a drastic change in facial expressions and body language, the apology can appear insincere or even sarcastic. And so naturally, she decided to hit me back in the face on purpose the next go round. And she very dryly mimicked my exact apology in the same sort of, um, I guess, deadpan expression that I had unintentionally done. And like I said, my apology was actually genuine, but I just didn't realize at the time that my delivery was all wrong. And so she did not get the impression that I was sincere in my apology. And I also remember being around 16 years old and going to a holiday party that my dad's coworker was hosting. And as soon as we walked into the party and I saw just how many people were there talking and mingling, I immediately reached for my mom's hand and I basically didn't leave her side for the entire night. And that sounds very strange. That's very strange behavior for most other 16-year-old girls, but I remember just being so overwhelmed at the thought of having to talk to people who I had never seen before and never met before, especially considering the struggles that I had already been dealing with for most of my life in the area of socializing and communicating. So, pretty much from the ages of 6 to 24, I was sitting on the sidelines and watching people my own age instantly form connections with people without even trying. And what was even more upsetting for me, especially in my college years, was watching the girls my age interact and flirt with the boys. And I just remember thinking to myself, how are they doing that? Like, what is the magic formula that all of them just automatically know? And why can't I figure it out when they make it look so simple? And so, oh, I even remember I was in middle school and we were at a cross country practice after school. And I remember just walking up to a group of girls that were on the team, and I literally just asked them, "How do you talk to boys?" I just asked them, like, with no sort of prior relationship, no sort of prerequisite to that. I just walked up and asked them because, of course, to me and my autistic brain, I'm like, I have a question, so I'm going to ask it. And of course, they all laughed at me. So now you're probably wondering, what does all of this have to do with me being an introvert? Well, during my junior year of high school, that's when I get diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder, which is a neurological disorder that affects my ability to socialize and communicate in the way that most people do. And it is a spectrum disorder, which means that it looks different in each individual who has it, especially in girls and boys. It looks a lot different in the behaviors that we exhibit. But basically, the brain's neural pathways that enable social and emotional communication, they're just not connected in the way that most other people's are connected. And so you can imagine that pretty much at this point, all of my life experiences up until this point are starting to make a lot of sense to me and my family. And looking back, I realized that my natural reaction to my innate struggles with socializing and communicating and being emotionally intelligent and all of that was to socially withdraw myself from the outside world, which in my mind makes me an introvert because I had eventually figured out that it was a lot less stressful for me, a lot less stressful, less overwhelming, and less embarrassing to be by myself or with just one or two people than it was to be with a lot of different people at once, where the stakes are just way too high in multiple groups of or multiple people in like a big group like that. So that's really the story of why I call myself an introvert. So now how did I overcome those struggles and how can you do the same without compromising your introverted personality? And in my opinion and in my experience, it really comes down to three crucial concepts. Number one is getting to the root of the insecurities that are making you socially withdrawn. Number two is connecting with your strengths as an introvert. And number three is not being afraid to try again. So, number one, getting to the root of the insecurities that are making you socially withdrawn. I strongly believe that at the root of many emotional and mental problems like shyness and social anxiety and being emotionally withdrawn and all those other things, at the root of those things is insecurity in oneself. And the causes of those insecurities are different for each of us based on our individual differences, experiences, genetic predispositions, upbringing. But most of the time, those all of those lead to a lack of confidence in yourself. So maybe you were bullied and rejected in school, which made you believe that you must just be naturally worthless and unlovable, which, if that's the case, you should listen to my episode called When Being Bullied as a Kid Makes You an Emotionally Withdrawn Adult after this episode is other. And I'll link to that in the description of this episode. Maybe you have a strained relationship with your parents that has broken something inside of you for years or even decades, or whatever the reasons for your insecurities are. I really encourage you to work through those issues and come to terms with the fact that sometimes bad things happen to us, even though we didn't deserve it. And we can't change what happened in the past. We can only try to look at ourselves and fix it, accept our situation, and just fix things going forward. And this type of mental work is not an overnight process, but you just have to start somewhere, whether that's with therapy or journaling or exercising or self reflection or time with family. And I promise that once you do finally get to the point where you can leave your insecurities behind, there is no turning back. And number two is connecting with your strengths as an introvert. So you may not be an extroverted socialite who's the life of the party, but you've got your own strengths that you can leverage in your own quiet and reserved way. And those strengths that I've recognized in myself as well as other introverts are the power of quiet, the power of introspection and deep thought, and the power of one on one connection. So, for quiet people, a lot of the important work for us is happening underneath the surface in peace and quiet, both in our alone time and in the moments where we are just listening to someone. And when we are finally ready to talk, whether it's just with one person or a few, it's likely to be a very thoughtful and meaningful conversation because we've already had so much time to gather our thoughts together and really um, think about what we want to say. Um, and I've even been in situations where people are willing to listen to you even more because they're not used to hearing you speak a lot, and so they actually want to hear what you have to say with even more urgency. And so when you really think about it, that can be really powerful, and that's nothing to scoff at. And I believe that by harnessing those strengths, you can be a mover and a shaker in a lot of different ways, even if it's not as loud and visible and outright as the more extroverted behaviors tend to be. And number three is not being afraid to try again. So, as we talked about earlier in this episode, the root of, or at least in my opinion, the root of many mental and emotional problems is insecurity in something that makes us doubt ourselves. And we also talked about how to go about overcoming those insecurities. But the work does not stop there. The final, and in my opinion, the never ending step is to stop being afraid to try again when things don't work out the first time or haven't worked out in the past. And in the context of this topic, that includes not being afraid to try again at socializing, connecting with others, maintaining relationships, and being yourself. And this point is one that really hits home for me because although my issues with socializing are a lot more manageable um, than they used to be, there's always going to be that part of me that makes me a misfit of sorts. Hence the name of my brand, the Introverted Misfit. But I've just come to, I've come to, I've come to realize that I'm just not going to let that those issues keep me in a state of constant fear for the rest of my life. So whatever your fears are, you can't let those keep you from trying again. Because once you get to a point where you just are not going to try again because some bad experiences from your past are really holding you back, that's when you are really going to just remain stuck in that state of fear. I once heard someone say that instead of looking at failure as something that didn't succeed, we should try to reframe it as something that just didn't work, an experiment that didn't work. And so we're just going to keep trying at it in a different way or from a different angle than previously. And I think that this issue really calls for a reframing of that nature. So instead of thinking of it as your past experiences with social rejection as you being a failure, think of them as a period in your life where something just wasn't quite right. And now you have the power to try again with a slightly different mindset and a different strategy because now we're grown-ups and we've got a lot of different avenues and um, different clubs and social gatherings that we can try. And so maybe back then you were confined to socializing in a school setting with a bunch of other young people who weren't necessarily a good fit for you, but you kind of had to be there because it's school and nobody can um you can't really just like skip over the period of life where you go to school. But now in your adulthood, you have the freedom to try other places that may be a better fit for you and a better fit for your personality. Or maybe in the past, you didn't have the best social skills and you were a little awkward. Or maybe you still are a little awkward like I am. But now you're not surrounded by people who are constantly set on picking apart every little thing you do or every little mistake that you make. And so you can be a little more confident when you do try to initiate conversations again and engage in social interactions. So that was the last point, is just to get out there and keep trying every day because every day that you're alive is a new opportunity to be better than yesterday. And that's all for today's episode. But before you go, I do want to offer you my free guide to becoming a socially confident introvert, which I will link to in the description of this episode. And if you are an introverted woman who is looking for a more tailored and extensive approach to becoming a socially confident version of yourself without having to act like an extrovert, you might enjoy enrolling in my self paced online course, Communicate with Quiet Confidence, which I will also link to in the description of this episode so that you can learn more about what you'll get out of that course. And as always, if you enjoyed this talk, please don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button, leave a review and or comment on whichever platform you're watching on, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, or Apple, and share this podcast with a friend. Thanks for listening and have a great day.